What's up everybody, hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our channel sponsors International MTG on TCG Player, as well as Martin from the Hobby Horse. We've also started a new Discord channel which is free to join, so come hang out with us. Link in the description of this video. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you a quick game that we filmed down at the Hobby Horse. This week's game features Foil playing his Athreos Shroud-Veiled deck, Ryan returning with his Obeka Splitter of Seconds deck, Falgar playing his favorite elemental Marath Will of the Wild, and Patrick borrowing Martin's Bristly Bill Sower deck. Now that we are fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Foil plays a tapped Azorius Guildgate, while Ryan plays a Swamp and Fog plays a NYAM Panorama. Patrick then draws for turn and plays a Forest before passing his turn to Foil, who plays an Evolving Wilds Kraken to go get a land from his library. Ryan draws for turn and then plays an island before tapping out in order to cast a Fellwar Stone. Fog plays a Plains for turn before passing to Patrick, who plays a second Forest for turn before tapping out in order to cast his commander, Bristly Bill. Foil plays a Swamp for turn before paying 2 for a Thought Vessel and passing to Ryan. Ryan plays a Mountain for turn, which then allows him to cast his commander, Obeka Splitter of Seconds. On his end step, Fog pays to crack his NYAM Panorama, going into his library to get a Forest to put into play tapped. Fog draws and plays a Mountain for turn, which then allows him to tap out and cast his commander, Marath, who enters play with 3+1/+1 counters. Patrick draws for turn and then plays another Forest, which has him putting a +1/+1 counter on his commander. He then taps out in order to cast a Hungering Hydra where X is equal to 2. Foil draws for turn and misses his land drop, so he just pays 3 and casts Mangara of Corondor. Ryan plays his second Mountain for turn before paying 2 and casting a Ring of Evos Isle. He then pays 1 to equip his commander with his ring before he then goes to combat, swinging him over at Fog for 2 commander damage. This then gives him 2 additional upkeep triggers, but he has nothing to do, so he passes. Fog draws and plays a contested Cliffs for turn before paying 4 and casting Wilderness Reclamation. He then goes to his end step, which has him untapping all of his lands, while Patrick then untaps and draws for turn. He then plays a Forest, putting a counter on his Hungering Hydra, before he then taps out in order to cast a Voracious Hydra where X is equal to 2. Foil draws for turn and plays another Swamp before paying 4 for a Pitiless Plunderer. Ryan untaps for turn and adds a counter to his commander before he then draws. He then plays his second Swamp for turn before he taps out in order to cast Plug and Nasari. He then goes to combat, and in response, Foil casts a Swords to Plowshares targeting Plug and Nasari, exiling it, which has Ryan gaining 5 life. Ryan then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Foil for 5 commander damage, which then gives him 5 additional upkeeps before he passes. On his end step, Fog pays to remove all the counters from Marath, creating him 3 1/1 elemental tokens. Fog then untaps and draws for turn before casting a Prosperous Partnership. This then has him creating 2 1/1 white and green citizen tokens before he then plays a tapped Kazul's Cliffs as his land for turn. Fog then taps 2 of his tokens in order to create a treasure token, which he then sacks and pays an additional green to cast a Poison Dart Frog. Patrick plays a Force for turn, putting an additional counter on his commander. He then taps out in order to activate his commander's ability, doubling all the 1/1 counters on all of his creatures. Fog then remembers he was supposed to untap all of his lands before Patrick then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Ryan for 6 commander damage. Foil starts his turn drawing a card before passing to Ryan. Ryan untaps for turn and puts another counter on his commander before he then draws. He then plays another Mountain for turn before going to combat, swinging his commander over at Patrick, who decides to double block with both of his Hydras. Ryan then flashes in an Embercleave, which has him taking out both of Patrick's Hydras and dealing 9 damage to Patrick. He then gets 9 additional upkeeps, but with nothing to do, he just passes his turn. On his end step, Fog taps 4 of his creatures to create 2 more treasure tokens before he then untaps and draws for turn. He then casts Takazi's Welcome, as well as casting Xanagos the Reveler. Fog then taps some creatures to create a treasure token before he then upticks Xanagos in order to create enough mana to help him recast Marath a second time. Marath then enters with 5 +1/+1 counters and also has Fog drawing a card before he then goes to his end step, untapping all of his lands. Patrick draws for turn and casts Ozolith the Shattered Spire before he then plays a Force as his land for turn, putting 2 counters on his commander. He then casts a Genesis Hydra for 2, which has him looking at the top 2 cards of his library, whiffing and putting both cards on the bottom of his library. Patrick then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Foil, who blocks with Mangara, before he then flashes in a Dictate of Erebos. This then has each player sacrificing a creature where Fog creates an elemental, which has him drawing a card when it enters play before dying. Foil draws for turn and then finally taps out in order to cast his commander, Athreos. He then goes to his end step, putting a coin counter on his Pitiless Plunderer, and in response, Fog pays 1 to create another elemental, drawing a card. Ryan plays a Mountain for turn before passing, and on his end step, Fog pays to create another elemental, drawing a card. Fog then pays to create an additional elemental before tapping his 6 remaining creatures, creating 3 treasure tokens. He then pays to remove the last counter from his commander, sending it to the command zone when it creates another elemental token. Finally, Fog untaps and draws a card for turn before playing a forest. He then pays to cast Impact Tremors before then upticking Xanagos, giving him enough mana to help him recast his commander a 3rd time. Marath then enters with 7 +1/+1 counters and Fog draws a card. He then casts Pure Imagine of Rascal, dealing 1 damage to each of his opponents, before he then casts a Cryptic Trilobite where X is equal to 2, dealing an additional damage to each of his opponents. This then gives Fog the final piece of his combo, and he demonstrates to the table how he can use the Trilobite and Marath to create infinite tokens, which has everyone dying to the Impact Tremors. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.